Today's Lunch and Learn, sponsored by our museum, the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. Today's Lunch and Learn is a virtual one, and we're very pleased to have with us today presenting Dr. Walter Curry. Dr. Curry is from Orangeburg, and his political science degree is from South Carolina State University. He went on to several graduate degrees in education and a doctorate in curriculum and instruction from Argosy University. In 2018, Dr. Curry launched his own company, Renaissance Publications, LLC, and published his first genealogy book, The Thompson Family, Untold Stories from the Past. This book chronicles reflections and experiences of his own relatives that shed new light on African-American history in Aiken County and in South Carolina. In October of the next year, he got the 2019 African-American Historical and Genealogy Society Book Award in the nonfiction category for this book. And on February 12th of this year, the South Carolina legislature recognized him for his significant work in service to African-American history and heritage. Dr. Curry is a member of several civic, historical, and professional organizations, including the South Carolina African-American Chamber of Commerce, the Aiken Barnwell Genealogical Society, and the African-American Historical and Genealogical Society. He volunteers for the International African-American Museum, coordinates outreach efforts to local stakeholders there. In addition, Dr. Curry has done several book signings and presentations at local conferences, workshops, bookstores, and schools across the state and nationwide. And let's hope when the great pestilence begins to fade away and we take our masks off, that you can go to one of these book signings and pick up his terrific book for yourself. His most recent project is Sally and the Thompson Family, an exhibit in Aiken County Historical Museum. Now, Dr. Curry, I think this one's already closed. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
He currently lives here in Columbia, South Carolina, with his wife, a registered nurse and USC graduate, and they have two sons, Braxton and Braylon. So that's a mouthful, but I've had the privilege of being at history events. I've had the privilege of being at history events at which Dr. Curry was also presenting, and that is exactly why I'm not going to take any more of his time telling you how great he is. I'm going to allow Dr. Curry to show you how great he is and to get into some of the meat of history. Real history is real stories about real people. That's what there is to learn from. And so, Dr. Curry, I'm going to pin your video. I don't know if that makes a difference or not.
Okay.
Take it from here. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe, for that wonderful introduction. First of all, I just want to say good afternoon to everybody. I am so excited that you all have taken the time to join me on this fabulous presentation. First, I just want to thank you for tuning in today. Just want to also commend all of you for your interest in learning about the history of my family, the Thompson family, the history of our state, but more importantly, the history of the African-American people. And so I commend you once again, and I thank you for joining me today. I just want to reintroduce myself, Dr. Walter B. Curry Jr. I am the founder of Renaissance Publications, LLC. The company is a self-publication company that was founded in September of 2018 that publishes books in genealogy, mainly the genealogy of my family, my paternal and maternal maternal side. This presentation is very dear and special to me. It is the presentation of my third great grandmother, who her name is Lavinia Corley Thompson. And so the topic of today's presentation is the personal story through slavery in South Carolina, through war and beyond. The personal story through slavery in South Carolina, through war and beyond. Now, the epiphany moment. When we define an epiphany, it means a divine manifestation or revelation or insight. And when you look at your family history, you will delve into those moments in your research that is a manifestation, an insight about your family history. And so during this presentation, I am going to share with you the moments that reflect the epiphany or the revelation or insights about my ancestor, Lavinia Corley Thompson. It began with a conversation. Oftentimes when we look at history and genealogy, particularly genealogy, we always have casual conversations about our history, about who we are. And those conversations reflect the nature of our research. Oftentimes when I speak with relatives about family members, they always tell me about family members, my grandparents and their parents, and we have these casual conversations. And you learn a lot about your family history through casual conversations, not only with your relatives, but also people who outside your family who remembered or remembers your relatives. So keep that in mind. Conversations are important. The conversations that I had about my ancestor story was with my grandfather's first cousin, who lived in Capitol Heights, Maryland. His name was Calvin Thompson. Calvin Thompson shared with me information about my ancestor. And he said to me, Cousin Walter, don't you know that we are a descendant of an enslaved cook who served in the Confederate Army? And I said to myself, you gotta be kidding me, because I was taught in school that African Americans served on the Union side. And so he said, well, yes, that's true. African Americans fought valiantly on the Union side, but also there were African Americans who also served on the Confederacy, on the Confederate side. So he sent me the information about my ancestor service. And I found out that there were several individuals and constituencies who did some research about my ancestor service in the Confederacy, but also did research on her life, her children who I recognized. And I knew then that this was real. And then I found out in the information that my ancestor received a Confederate pension. And I'm going to go into the details about that during this presentation. But all of that that I just said was the Eureka moment. you know, you get those Eureka moments that kind of like an aha, like, wow, this is real, this is great, make you feel good. And so the Eureka moment came to me when I realized that my ancestors' service in the Confederate Army as an enslaved cook, as the only woman recognized to receive a Confederate pension in the state of South Carolina, was and still is the Eureka moment. Now, the Eureka moment also percolated when I did some more research about my ancestor. I found out that she, if you look at her record to the right, this record of her service is located in a publication called South Carolina's African-American Confederate Pensioners, dated 1923, 1925. The book is still in publication, and the author is Alexia Jones Helsley. Professor Helsley has done research on African-American Confederate pensioners. I met her research and her knowledge and background is impeccable. But when I looked at my ancestor's service and her record, as you see on the right, that really shook me, because, you know, you read about famous people all the time in African-American history and in history in general. But when you see someone who is a relative and they are recognized in a book, that is a very special moment. And for me, to see my ancestor listed in this book is the Eureka moment. Also, when you look at genealogical research, you have a tendency to look at things that are around you. One of the strategies that I have discovered through my colleague, Ms. Robin Foster, she always say that when you want to delve into your research, you want to look around your house, your relative's house, and find out what you have, and use that as a starting point. And so the first page of this booklet is the Thompson Family Old Family Reunion book that was published back in 1987. And when I read this book, I immediately remembered and met some of the relatives mentioned, but there were several primary source documents in the book that has helped me in my research. And one of the documents in the book will be highlighted during this presentation. Now, we're going to go ahead and get started in the gist of the presentation. The first part is the genesis or the beginning of Lavinia's family. Now, Lavinia's mother, Phyllis Corley. Phyllis was an African. Like many enslaved Africans, Phyllis was captured and journeyed through the Middle Passage. How I discovered Phyllis' journey here to America was through an oral narrative that Lavinia told her grandchildren. And in the oral narrative, she stated that her mother came to this country on a boat, on a boat. And so when I read that narrative, which was written by a relative, I immediately discovered that Phyllis came over here during the Middle Passage. And you can look at the map on the right, you will see the routes of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was very triangular. Africa, South America, and North America, and also in Europe. Now, the Middle Passage, when my ancestor Phyllis was on the Middle Passage, it was a very turbulent journey. Many slaves were on these large ships. They were treated as cargo, okay? And when they were on these ships, they were chained together and they were shackled. If you look at the picture on the right, the picture is slave shackles. These slave shackles were made out of iron. And so think about a slave with those shackles on their hands, on their feet, around the ankles, above their feet, their necks. The shackles added a lot of weight and pain to the slaves. And so it was very painful. And then for them to be together on the ship, chained together, fetus all over the place, little air, little food. It was a very difficult time, and it was a monstrosity. And so when I think about my Lavinia's mother, my ancestor Phyllis, and how she was able to survive the Middle Passage, like I said, they were treated like cargo because some of the slaves were thrown overboard. The sharks followed the ships. Some of the slaves even committed suicide. So it was a very painful experience for many enslaved Africans. But for my ancestor to survive all of that, and think about the time that it took from Africa to North America. I mean, we're not talking about just months, we're talking about years. It took ships about no more than 2 years, according to several historians, to get from Africa to North America. Now, when my ancestor Phyllis arrived here in South Carolina, she was first owned by Matthew Burden. Matthew Burden was a plantation owner who lived in the Orangeburg district, known as Orangeburg County today. Matthew Burden, when he passed away, what he did, what the state did, was they had to determine how they were going to disseminate the slaves. And so Matthew Burden's friend, Joshua Corley, he applied legally to get all of Matthew's slaves. And so when you look at this document, you see the slaves, and I'm just going to read it to you briefly, that all the right, interest, and title of the state to the following Negro slaves, to wit, Bob, Maria, Bill, Prince, Harry, Phyllis. This is her right here. my ancestor Phyllis, Lavinia's mother, and other slaves that were with her. And so you look at this document, they were owned by Matthew Burton, and then later on, they were owned by Joshua Corley, who later became Phyllis' enslaved master. Now, one thing that I also learned too in my genealogical research, that when you delve into African-American genealogy, particularly if you have enslaved ancestors, you also want to look at the families who own your enslaved ancestors. And that's exactly what I did. And so let's look at Joshua Corley, who was my ancestor Phyllis' master. Joshua's wife name was Anna. They had 5 children. Their children's names were Thornton, Henry, Cynthia, Julia, and Samson. The family attended Tabernacle Baptist Church located in Sally, South Carolina. And Joshua was a farmer and justice of the peace. And as a justice of the peace, he was tasked to settle disputes. Now, like I said earlier, that Tabernacle Baptist Church was where Joshua Corley and his family attended. Now, this church is very interesting because back in the day, slaves attended this church as well. When you go inside the church, you will see where it used to be the balcony. Slaves, when they attended church services with their masters, the masters and their families, they sat in the pews, the main congregation area, and the slaves that sat at the top. And so today, when you go to Tabernacle Baptist Church, you will see where the slaves actually sat at during worship service. So it is a very historic church, and I'm going to enlighten you on that later on during the presentation and how that connects to our family. Now, Joshua Corley Plantation. I did some research about his plantation, and I found that his plantation located in the Barnwell district, Kitchens Mill between Sally and Aiken. Back in the day, counties were called districts. Before Aiken County was formed in 1871, it was a part of Barnwell district. And the plantation acreage was 4,611 acres. So it was a very huge plantation. And the plantation was located near the banks of the South Edisto River. And this is an actual plat of the plantation retrieved from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. And many plantations were on the banks of the South Edisto River in the Barnwell district because the river was a major transportation route that shipped goods from the Barnwell district around that area all the way down to the Low Country. So many plantation owners like Joshua Corley was able to ship their goods to the Low Country. And they did it using the South Edisto River. Now, another interesting discovery about Joshua Corley was his slave ownership. When you do research, particularly African-American genealogy, it's important to know your enslaved master and the slaves that they own. It's called a slave schedule. And so when you look at a slave schedule, those schedules don't list the names of the slaves. Some do, but most of the slave schedules do not. But it does list the name of the master. You see on this slave schedule here, Joshua Corley. You see this mark, which represents a quantity, one, and that is relevant throughout the slave schedule. And you see the age of the slave, the gender, whether or not they were male or female, and their race. Although they don't list the name of the slaves per se, but if you know your enslaved master, if you know the date that your enslaved ancestor was born, you could pretty much do a cross-reference. And so according to the 1850 slave schedule, Joshua owned 22 slaves, 12 female and 10 male. So he had a lot of slaves on his plantation. Now, I also found out a little bit about Joshua Corley business. And I located the agricultural census. Why is that important? Because you want to know the business that your enslaved the enslaved master was in, the crops that he or she grew. And so the 1850 agricultural census revealed that Joshua grew peas, beans, sweet potatoes, bushels of wheat, and bushels of Indian corn. And when you look at the highlighted area, the numbers of quantities, and you look at the top are categories, okay? And those categories reveal the quantities of each crop. And also the acreage of land that they farm to. So for instance, Joshua Corley, he farmed about 40 acres of the, I don't know, 130 acres of land that he farmed, but he didn't farm the other 40 acres. Now, Joshua Corley and Anna, his wife, they lived pretty long lives. Joshua Corley was born in 1782. He died in 1857. His wife, Anna Corley, was born in 1788, and she died in 1858. And their graves are at Tabernacle Baptist Church. Now, Phyllis family, my ancestor Phyllis. Phyllis' children, she had children from Robert Staley. She had 3 daughters. My third great grandmother, Lavinia, she was born on June the 4th, 1844. She had a sister named Laura and Nancy. And then later on, Phyllis married John Corley, and they had 1 child, Harry. Now, we're going to go into Lavinia enslaved experience. Now, this document is another Eureka moment. This document is actually a recorded narrative that my great-grandmother, half-sister, Nettie Thompson Johnson, she, along with some of my great-grandmother's first cousins, they listened to Lavinia and her experience during slavery. This is actually a slave narrative, and we know about slave narratives that slaves told about their experiences during slavery. But the Eureka moment came to me when I found this narrative in the old Thompson Family reunion book. And just want to go over this narrative right quick. It says here that Lavinia Corley Thompson is the husband of Reverend Logan Thompson. And when you look at this narrative, she was very detailed. She said that her sister, Mary Woodard Evans, came over here on a boat, okay? They came on her mother, Phyllis, came over here on a boat. Both were born to a slave mother from Africa, okay? The morning Viney, as she was called, and Mary were going to be sold in Tallahassee, Florida. The two girls talked it over, and each said they were going to listen real good to hear and see where they were being sold to and to whom. As of this day, we don't know how much Mary was sold for, but we do know that Viney was sold for $100. Grandma Viney later told her story to some of her grandchildren who I just mentioned, my great aunt. Grandma Viney said, "I must have been the pretty thing that day because I bought in that much money." She told the slave auctioneer, "You might as well sell me over because I ain't a goat." At the time, her dress was white. Her master beat her all the way home till her dress was so bloody that you couldn't see the white on it. When I read that narrative, it really shocked me to see that I have a piece of history of my ancestor who experienced one of the most tragic horrors of slavery, because like her, many enslaved folk were beaten by their masters and their auctioneers. So just to think about the trauma that she faced during that experience. And it was so riveting to me, because if she would have been killed by her auctioneer because of her disobedience, I would not be here today. And she survived that. Now, later on, Lavinia, just to note that she too was a slave on Joshua Corley Plantation. Later on, Lavinia was reassigned to Samuel G. The G stands for Greenberry, Samuel's middle name, and Charlotte Corley Webb. Charlotte Webb was the daughter of Joshua and Anna Corley, Lavinia and Phyllis enslaved masters. Her husband's name was Samuel G. Webb. They had several children, Sumter, Houston, Henry, Lucian, Edward, Byron, Nelson, Elizabeth, and Francis. And Samuel was a tanner. He made leather belts, and he did that for a living. Now, the Webb estate. Samuel and Charlotte lived next door to Joshua Corley Plantation. You see the plat here. The plantation acreage was 624 acres. Now, I also delved into Samuel Webb slave ownership. According to the 1860 slave schedule, Samuel owned 7 slaves. The record only showed 3 females and 2 males. I want you to look at the highlighted area, okay? The highlighted area is actually my ancestor, Lavinia. And let me tell you how that is. Like I said earlier during the presentation, you want to do cross-referencing when it comes to identifying your ancestors in the slave schedule. So what I did was I subtracted the year of the slave schedule, 1860. I subtract that from the year that Lavinia was born. She was born in 1844, and boom, 16. Okay, so this is actually her. She was 16 years old when she was with Samuel Webb, a female, Black. This is Lavinia's, this is her right here. Now, we're going to go into the war between the states, known as the Civil War. Now, the seeds of war. South Carolina succeeded from the Union on December the 20th, 1860. Now, before we get into the other aspects of succession, keep in mind, and it's important to understand that South Carolina, when they succeeded from the Union, they considered themselves as an independent nation, okay? They were not considered to be an independent state. They considered themselves as an independent nation. They signed the Ordinance of Succession, and they declared themselves independent from the entire United States. And so they had their own president, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, okay, the same positions in the United States government. And at the time, they were raising an army to protect the state and go to war if necessary. Now, on February the 8th, 1861, South Carolina, along with 10 other states, joined the Confederacy. They officially joined the Confederacy. And the Confederacy were the states that succeeded from the United States or the Union. On April the 12th, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Union or United States, they still occupied the fort. The Confederacy, they fired the guns, their guns on Fort Sumter. And this event led to the beginning of the war between the states known as the Civil War. Now, South Carolina mobilized for war, okay? The shots at Fort Sumter was fired. South Carolina was in a predicament along with the other Confederate states, and they had to mobilize for war. In other words, they had to draft soldiers, and they had to solicit volunteers. And so what they did was there were white men and freedmen, either volunteered or drafted. White men and freedmen as young as 13, okay, 13-year-old, 14-year-old, okay, were drafted or volunteered to fight to defend South Carolina and to defend the Confederacy. But also, when you look at enslaved labor, okay, slaves between the ages of 16 and 50 were impressed, meaning that they were forced to join the fight. The state required plantation owners to send some of their slaves to join the military effort. Some actually fought. Some did, they had non-combatant roles, which we're going to discuss later on. But enslaved labor, and the slave labor actually was the backbone of the labor force in South Carolina. Now, one thing that many historians do not point out, that the Confederacy had racially integrated units, okay? That means blacks and whites were not segregated. They were together. Horace Greeley, in his book, The American Conflict, reveals that point. And he says here, for more than 2 years, Negroes had been extensively employed in the belligerent operations by the Confederacy. They had been embodied and drilled as rebel soldiers and had paraded with white troops at a time when this would not have been tolerated in the armies of the Union. So the Union actually had segregated units, okay? But the Confederacy didn't. And it was until 1848 when President Truman signed legislation to integrate soldiers. The Barwell District military units, where Samuel Webb and Lavinia lived, they also raised companies of troops. The 11th Regiment Reserves of the 43rd Barnwell Company A, the 2nd Regiment of South Carolina troops of the 43rd Barnwell E, and Samuel Webb, Lavinia Master, joined the 11th Regiment. The role of African Americans, go back here, okay. Current slide. Okay, the role of African Americans in the Confederate war effort. This picture is the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, 1861. These group of men were freed African Americans who lived in Louisiana. Many of them were Creoles, and the Creole culture is very rich in Louisiana. And so, according to many historians, this Louisiana Native Guard was the first organized military regiment in African-American military regiment in this country. And it was on the Confederate side. Later on, some of the members of the Native Guard defected to the Union side, and the Union also had the Louisiana Native Guard. So it's two groups. You had the Confederate Louisiana Native Guard, and you had the Union Native Guard. Now, African Americans in the Confederacy, they were live actors in the military operation. Some served as soldiers, some served as teamsters, some served as body servants and cooks. Now, the Confederate government was decentralized. Under the Confederate states, under the Confederate government, rather, states were more sovereign. They had more control. The central Confederate government was very weak. It was less effective. It gave them more control over their military efforts, which include recruitment, drafting, and impressment. Decentralization allowed Confederate states to enlist African Americans in the military. And that's very, very important to understand, because legally, the Confederacy allowed the raising of African Americans at the end of the war in 1865. That was passed by the Confederate Congress, mainly enslaved labor. However, there were states like South Carolina who raised units of African Americans to join the war effort. Now, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, his quotation documenting the service of African Americans in the Confederate Army is very enlightening. And this is another Eureka moment for me. And I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but the first lines I'm going to read. It is now pretty well established that there are, at the present moment, many colored men in the Confederate Army doing duty not only as cooks, servants, and laborers, but as real soldiers having muskets on their shoulders. And this was a source that came out of Dudley's Taylor Cornish, the saber-armed Negro troops in the Union Army. Frederick Douglass saw and recognized that there were Blacks who were fighting for the Confederacy. And what people need to know, that Frederick Douglass used that revelation to convince Lincoln to recruit Blacks to fight in the Union Army, okay? Because before Blacks enlisted in the Union Army, the Union Army was all white. Frederick Douglass convinced Lincoln to recruit Black Union soldiers. And because of that, okay, because of that, and I'm gonna go back, that act that Frederick Douglass did to convince Lincoln was one of the reasons why African Americans was able to participate in the United States Army. And that stemmed from his recognition of African Americans serving in the Confederate Army. Now, Lavinia joined the military effort. Lavinia's military service. On September the 1st, 1863, Lavinia joined her master Samuel Webb in his unit. Lavinia served as a cook until the end of the war. Now, the role of Confederate camp Confederate cook camps. Now, when you look at the Confederate camp cooks, they had a lot of supervisory roles, okay? They told the soldiers where they should hunt at, what food that they were gonna eat, the procession, when they got in line to eat their food. So they actually told the soldiers about what food that they were going to eat. So they were in a supervisory role. Camp cooks had to cook sometimes in unpleasant and dangerous conditions. A lot of them were near the front lines of battle, okay? Unpleasant conditions. Many of the troops had to move from one place to another place. They were constantly moving, particularly troops that were fighting in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, the rough, rugged mountain terrain, going up those hills in those valleys. It really took a toll on them. And some of the troops were building fortifications in the hot sun, okay? Think about the mosquitoes and the moisture. Very unpleasant, dangerous conditions that cooks had to endure. Camp cooks had to preserve food because of food shortages. Keep in mind, the Union Army had more food than the Confederacy because they had more food producing factories. The Confederacy did not have a lot of food producing factories. So they had to preserve their food, usually can their food, and they had to hunt for their food, particularly those who ate meat. Confederate cookware and food. This is an artifact from my exhibit. And if you look at this artifact here, this is a cast iron skillet, okay? The cast iron skillet was frequently used by cooks to cook food over an open fire, okay? That was the purpose of the cast iron skillet, but it also cooked the food quickly as well. If you look at the food here, these shortcakes are called Johnny cakes. It was a major food source for the many Confederate soldiers. Johnny cakes are mainly your cornbread, even your plain cupcakes. And these crumblings are hardtack, okay? The Union Army had a lot of hardtack. That was a major food source for them. But when the Confederate soldiers, when they captured the Union troops, they will get the hardtack from them. And the hardtack, when you eat it, it's very painful. It brings pain to your jaw. Think of it like a candy jar breaker. Now, Samuel's and Lavinia military exploits. I did some research on Samuel's military journeys through his military records, and I found out many interesting facts of where he went. And more than likely, Lavinia was with him. From September to 1863 until May or June 1864, Samuel was at the Augusta Arsenal. That was a facility that produced large quantities of military technology for the Confederacy. It's located in Augusta, Georgia. And this is a picture of the arsenal, as well as Samuel Webb's military record that shows that he was there. James Island, near Charleston, South Carolina, on November the 15th, 1864. Samuel military unit built fortifications on the island, and that was very difficult work. Fortifications are basically defensive barriers that soldiers built to prevent attacks. And this is his military record that proves that he was there. The Confederate withdrawal into North Carolina, that was in early 1865. Samuel unit joined Rhett's brigade under General James Johnston command that engaged Union General William Sherman in eastern North Carolina. Rhett's brigade was engaged in Adamsboro, North Carolina on March the 15th, 16th, 1865. And this picture I took, I actually went to the battlefield coming from Washington, D.C. several years ago. The Battle of Adamsboro is a historic site in eastern North Carolina. And this is a monument that was erected by the South Carolina Civil War Commission to honor the troops that were there from South Carolina. And Rhett's brigade was there. Now, Lavinia's life after the war. Post-war events. After the war ended in 1865, Lavinia met and married the Reverend Logan Thompson in 1871. Logan was a carpenter and he was a widower before he met Lavinia, and he had children from his first wife. Logan and Lavinia had 6 children: Della, Governor, Robert, Queen, Effie, and my second great-grandfather, Oscar. The family attended Smyrna Missionary Baptist Church, located near Springfield, South Carolina. That church actually was founded by slaves, and those slaves worshiped at Tabernacle Baptist Church. Remember in the presentation, I mentioned Tabernacle Baptist Church. Well, those slaves who were members of Tabernacle founded Smyrna, and Tabernacle helped Smyrna during the early years in its existence. When Logan died on August the 4th, 1901, the day before his birthday, Lavinia became a widower, living next door to her children. This is a tragedy that I discovered talking to my cousins who passed away. And like I said about these casual conversations, he told me that Lavinia's grandson, Governor Mint Thompson Jr., was tragically murdered at the age of 10. In fact, his father, Governor, had a major beef or dispute with the murderer, John Rack Odom. And John Rack Odom came to Governor's house. He was aiming for Governor Sr., but he shot Governor Sr.'s son, Governor Jr., and he died. And there was a gunshot near the side, near his stomach. Black Confederate pensions. Now, South Carolina passed an act called Act 63. On March the 16th, 1923, the South Carolina legislature approved pensions to African Americans who faithfully served in the Confederate Army. The law stipulated that African Americans who served in the Confederacy as cooks, servants, or attendants were eligible for a pension. Other qualifications included at least 6 months of active service, recommendation of the county pension board, and supporting affidavits. An affidavit means a written statement that affirms something that is true, okay? And so the witnesses had to have, they had these affidavits. On March 23rd, 1923, the Comptroller General appropriated $600,000 to Confederate veterans, but only $3,000 to Negro slaves. So it's a huge discrepancy here. That means that the state didn't appropriate a lot of money to slaves who served in the Confederate Army. Huge discrepancy. Lavinia applied for her pension and was approved. And this is another Eureka moment. Lavinia, who served until the end of the war, applied for a pension on May the 11th, 1923. 3 days later, her pension was approved on May the 15th, 1923. And you can see the copy of her pension, her master, Samuel Webb, her signature right here. She was 78 years old. And these two individuals, Harrison Davis and Jane Anderson, were slaves on the plantation that Lavinia lived on. And so they became lifelong friends after the Civil War. And this pension you could find at the South Carolina Department of Archives, and it's also online on their website. Lavinia's death. On June the 8th, 1928, 3 days after her birthday, Lavinia died as a widow at the age of 84. She was very old, and she was buried at Smyrna Missionary Baptist Church in Springfield, South Carolina. This is her actual grave marker and her husband's grave marker. This grave marker was installed when we had a memorial service honoring her service back in 2018. And so on this marker, it shows the regiment that she served in. She died a few days after her birthday, similar to Logan. Logan also died a few days after his birthday. Other highlights, Lavinia Memorial Service, like I said earlier, it was on October 18th, 2018 at Smyrna Missionary Baptist Church in Springfield. We had tremendous community support. Local elected officials were there, members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the South Carolina African-American Chamber of Commerce, the church itself, family members, and people from the community came and honored my ancestor service, and not only her service, but her life as well. And this flag is the Bonnie Blue flag. That was the first flag of the Confederacy, believe it or not. That was the flag that represented independence. That flag was flown over Fort Sumter when Fort Sumter fell to the Confederacy. Sally and the Thompson family exhibit. We had our exhibit for several months this year, from February the 1st, 2020 to August the 1st, 2020 at the Aiken County Historic Museum in Aiken, South Carolina. I encourage everyone to visit the museum. It has rich history, resources, and artifacts about the diverse history of Aiken County. And in the exhibit, we had artifacts and information about my ancestors according to individually. This part of the exhibit, Lavinia's exhibit, the dress that she wore, that she would have worn. This is a wrapper, traditional dress that enslaved females wore during the days of slavery. The cookware that she used as a cook was donated by the Confederate Museum in Greenville. The cooking utensils here, the food, and we also had a display table. Just want to note too, the flag, the state flag that was given to our family during the memorial service, and the bonnet blue flag that was pitched near the grave marker. Also, the story of my ancestor, Lavinia Corley Thompson. There are copies available. My book, The Thompson Family, Untold Stories from the Past, from 1830 to 1960, written by yours truly. Copies are available on Amazon. If you need autographed copies, you can contact me at Renaissance Publications, LLC at gmail.com, or you can reach me at 803-404-2117. Just want to thank you for listening to my presentation. I really appreciate your time and your patience. I hope you learned something today about my ancestor, Lavinia, her personal story through slavery, and beyond. And now I will entertain questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curry. I know I learned a good deal. And one question that we received, do you have any idea about what year that Phyllis crossed the Atlantic? What year or what decade she came across the Middle Passage?
I don't know the exact year. That's something that I definitely want to find out. In fact, when you look at research of African ancestors who came over here during the Middle Passage, that research is ongoing as far as locating primary sources. There is some movement in that direction. Hopefully, I could take time to do that. But I could say that she was here in South Carolina, I would say around the 1830s up to the birth of my ancestor and even after that. So that's the only record I have of her existence. But hopefully I'll find out one day.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's come through and Dr. Curry, I might have a little something on this question too. Mm-hmm. Has anyone looked into whether free persons of color served in the Confederate Army or connections between African Americans who served in the Confederate Army and those who served in Reconstruction rifle clubs or the state militia?
Well, let me ask that question. I could really tell you that there were several freed African Americans who served in the Confederate Army from South Carolina. There are two that I know that has documented biographies. Henry Dad Brown, who was a drummer in the Confederate Army. His story is very interesting. He volunteered to serve in the Confederate Army because he wanted to protect his loved ones, his family, his friends, and his neighbors. He also served in the Mexican-American War, and his service is documented in the early 1860s. In fact, when he served as a drummer in the Confederate Army, he stole a pair of Union drumsticks and used them. And then later on, he settled down. His wife became one of the founders of Macedonia Baptist Church in Darlington. Also, Henry Dad Brown became a corner of Darlington County. And this was during Reconstruction. And there is a marker honoring Henry Dad Brown in Darlington. He's also listed in the Green Book, the African-American Green Book, that is widely circulated here in South Carolina. I recommend folks purchasing it. And then there was a gentleman by the name of Charles Hayne who was drafted. Remember I said that there were freemen that were drafted into the Confederate Army, and he was a body servant. Later on, after the war, he became a teacher in the Barnwell district. He taught school there, and he, along with several other African Americans, founded Aiken County. Charles Hayne served in the legislature during the time that him, Prince Rivers, who was a former slave who escaped slavery, went to the Union Army. He became one of the founders and legislators from Aiken County, and Samuel J. Lee, who was a body servant to Samuel McGowan. Samuel J. Lee was a slave. He later on became the first African-American Speaker of the House during Reconstruction. So Charles D. Hayne and Henry Dad Brown are the only two that I know who were freemen. Brown volunteered, and Haynes was drafted.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Curry.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who decided to invest some time with some stories of history today. It seems like every history presentation I see is a starting point. It's always a jumping off to learn more. There's a lot more out there to learn. I do encourage you all to look into getting a copy of Dr. Curry's book for yourself. And of course, we'd love to have you come and stroll around the relic room as well. We are open. We're following a mask and a distancing protocol, but we are open and doing history here. So thank you all very much for your attendance today. Thank you, Dr. Curry.
Thank you.
For presentation.
Thank you.
And may your book and your history endeavors prosper.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Same to you. Thank you, everybody.